Hello, everybody. Welcome. Good evening. I'm Sister Maria Pascuzzi. I am the Director of Spirit Alive. And on behalf of the Sisters of St. Joseph of Brentwood, New York, I want to welcome all of you, especially those of you who will be joining us for the first time tonight. During the course of tonight's discussion, please feel free to submit questions in the Q&A box and throughout the evening, anytime you want. And at about 8:30, we'll be pausing to answer some of your questions. Also, if you wish to have closed captioning so you can read along with listening to the discussion, please click the CC box on your screen to activate that feature. If you have a laptop, I think it's on the bottom. If you're using your iPad, I believe it would be on the top. Tonight, we begin our fall programs mindful that this year marks the 60th anniversary of the Second Vatican Council, the start of the Second Vatican Council, whose implementation remains a work in progress. Throughout his pontificate, Pope Francis has advanced the call of the Second Vatican Council to reform the Church and has promoted synodality as the way the Church, that is, all of us who are the people of God, can participate in and bring about the Church's reform and its renewal. In a speech given in October 2015, the Holy Father stated, "The path of synodality is the path God expects of the Church in the third millennium. What the Lord asks of us is already contained, in a sense, in the word synod, which means walking together." For Francis, a synodal church is above all a listening church, not the laity listening to the hierarchy, but everyone involved in a reciprocal process in which a community of free and open people, united in solidarity, express and listen to different points of view and engage in self-criticism and discernment. In that spirit of open listening, Spirit Alive has arranged for 3 roundtables this fall to listen to the voices of younger men and women who are growing up in the Church, perhaps on the margins of the Church, and those who have grown older in the Church and still feel an urgency and responsibility to participate in its reform and its renewal. These latter voices are the voices we will be listening to tonight. So let me begin by introducing our guests for the evening, beginning with our roundtable moderator, Kerry Robinson. There you are, Kerry, welcome. Kerry, though not a boomer, herself is a well-known figure in Catholic circles who writes and speaks on subjects of philanthropy, development, and the Catholic Church and its mission. She is the recipient of 6 honorary doctoral degrees and awards too numerous to mention, all in recognition of her service to the Church. Next, I want to welcome Dr. Mary Meehan. Mary is was the former president of Alverno College in Milwaukee and former interim president at Seton Hall University, where I had the opportunity to meet her. She has an extensive professional healthcare background and has served as CEO of St. Mary's Hospital in New Jersey and St. Vincent's Hospital in Harrison, New York. Mary is a fellow in the American College of Healthcare Executives and is a licensed professional mental health counselor. All handy when you're president of a college, right, Mary? Next, I want to welcome Gloria Purvis, a well-known author, podcaster, and whole life activist who currently hosts the Gloria Purvis podcast from American Media. Gloria, also not a boomer, but someone who has a long life of faithful service in the Church, regularly appears in various media outlets, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, PBS NewsHour, Catholic Answers Live. In 2021, we're happy to say Notre Dame University appointed her as the inaugural pastoral fellow in the university's Office of Life and Human Development. Congratulations, Gloria. Finally, I welcome Dr. Jeffrey Burns, who is the director of the Center for Catholic Thought and Culture at the University of San Diego, as well as the director of the Academy of American Franciscan History. He is a widely published author. He teaches at the Franciscan School of Theology in San Diego, is an ordained deacon of the Diocese of Oakland, and in his spare time is a chaplain at the Newman Center at the University of California at San Diego. So thank you all for taking the time out of your very busy schedules to participate in this Spirit Alive event. So Carrie, I'd like to turn the evening over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Sister Maria. Wonderful. Welcome, Gloria, Mary, and Jeff. What an honor to be with you for this conversation. Let's just jump straight into this discussion. As Sister Maria just explained, Spirit Alive has organized a series of panel discussions with thought leaders like yourselves. And one interesting aspect is the chance to focus on the church through the lens of different age demographics. Mary and Jeff, you both fall into the baby boomer category. In the US, your age cohort seems to be particularly well represented in terms of mass attending churchgoers. So I want to begin with you, Mary. Why do you think your generation continues to stay with a church that has seen many others walk away?
Well, you know, Carrie, it's funny because I was just recently with a group of women who I attended elementary school with, who I had not seen in literally over probably now almost 60 years. And we were talking exactly about this question. And we were talking about the fact that when we grew up, I grew up in the city of Orange, New Jersey, 30,000 people, 5 Catholic churches. And when people would ask you, where do you live? You'd say the name of your parish. So I'd say St. John's. And everyone immediately knew a lot about you because of where you lived. And so our culture was such that it wasn't just the fact that we went to Catholic school. Our whole lives, on Valentine's Day, if our parents went anywhere, they went to the church, dance. So we talked about the fact that when it's that part of the thick culture, as sociologists would call it, it really becomes part of your DNA. And we think of ourselves as Catholic, regardless of whatever some of our challenges may be. And certainly all of us, at least within my group, we have things that we question and that aren't always easy for us. But I think it's that, cradle Catholic, we're here and it's our church and we're going to stick with it and we're going to make it work the best we can despite its challenges. So I think that's why. I think there's a lot of other personal reasons. And I would just also give a shout out to the religious women, because my faith certainly came from them. And I think that's something that other generations are now losing because of the lack of vocations in that area. But I think we need to be mindful that that is where certainly my faith came.
Oh, Jeff, you need to take yourself off mute. Yeah.
I just wanted to jump in and say, I grew up in Orange, California. So we have the two oranges represented. But I agree with Mary. What struck me is that we had such a clear identity. There was no sense of questioning about it. I grew up, I wouldn't have thought to question whether I was Catholic or not. And that was sort of deeply rooted, and it's just carried throughout my life.
Gloria, do you want to comment on this generation? And we're almost in this cohort, but
Yeah. I was thinking actually from the perspective of Black Catholics who are boomers, especially considering some of the things that people experience at Mass, at church. Actually, I was speaking with a gentleman yesterday as I was traveling who is a boomer, and he was talking to me about how when he was in Mass with his mom in Chicago, they were at a church that was predominantly white, and the pastor got up and said the Black sheep are not his, explicitly. And he said to his mom, "Why are we even staying here?" And she said, "Because despite what Father is saying about us, we know that Jesus is real." And they believed in the teachings of the church, despite the kind of mistreatment that they received. So it seems, and I do say about Black Catholics that they have an uncommon faith, considering how, the relationship to the church in the United States to African Americans in this country. It seems, though, that people stay because they believe that the teachings of the church are true, even if their co-religionists don't treat them as if they also believe the teachings of the church.
Wow, powerful. This is a bit of a segue to the corollary, which is, what do you think are some of the reasons that people, particularly in this generation, leave the church when they do leave?
If I was just going to continue on with that, I will say it's a fatigue of not being able to see the truth in the teachings because it's so clouded by the negative experiences that they have been have had, especially since the murder of George Floyd. I've talked to so many Black Catholics across the country that just could not attend Mass without feeling as if it was an occasion of sin because of the derision and hostility toward movements like Black Lives Matter, toward the, they felt like their suffering was unimportant and invisible to the congregation. And that it became going to Mass and experiencing that and hearing certain things even preached by the pastor against a movement for justice as it pertained to Black people just became too much. So some people left because they said, you know what, I still believe in God, but going to Mass and hearing and experiencing this became an occasion of sin. And so they felt that it was better that they go someplace else where they don't feel like going to worship God had become an occasion of sin for them.
Yeah, I'd like to follow up on that in terms of my own colleagues. I think in the 80s and 90s in particular, the image of the church became one big no. When you thought about what did the church represent, it wasn't talking about the love of God or community or things like that. It was no to contraception, no to abortion, no to same-sex marriage, no to euthanasia, which are all important issues, but that became the face of the church. And so that when you looked for something to engage, it wasn't there. It was the no that came through so strongly, and it got the term used, fatigue, I think is a good one.
I agree. I'd also add that, I was president of a women's college for 12 years, and it would be interesting and fascinating to me how many times young women would come up to me and say, you teach us that we can do anything a man can do, but not in they'd call it my church, not in your church. And I think the role of women, one of my closest friends was a woman, a religious for over 20 years, and she left religious life and then ended up leaving the church because she felt women didn't have a voice. So I think these are all very important and compelling issues that we're grappling with, but don't seem to have all the answers.
The other issue that really was strong for my generation, I think, is the issue of authority. Almost, the vast majority of the people I know that have left the church left because they had some experience that was very negative with a pastor or a bishop or someone, and they came with a certain need and they were rejected or felt that their needs weren't addressed. So I think that sort of encounter with authority is very widespread for people of the boomer generation.
Well, listening to each of you, it strikes me that a common theme is the perception that the church is not recognizing me for who I am, is not welcoming, is not meeting me in my lived experience. And so there's a sense of not feeling at home or welcome here. Given those very, I think, profound and important reasons why people leave the church, what changes do you believe are needed for renewed participation in the life of the church?
This is really something that I think could be done without even having to say something, but I really think parishes and cathedrals need to look at their images of holiness. Is there anything that isn't a white European depiction of Jesus and the Blessed Mother? I remember speaking with actually several people that said the only images in their church of a Black man was the Satan under the foot of a blonde-haired, blue-eyed Saint Michael. And so it doesn't require anything to be said to just have images of holiness that actually depict humanity. To also have pictures of saints on the wall, that are from the diaspora, from other continents and other cultures other than white European. Not that anybody has a problem with the Italian Jesus, the German looking Jesus, or, all the European saints. People don't have a problem with that. Is that, well, they would like to also see themselves in these depictions of holiness. That's all. But that sometimes can seem to be a hard thing. But those are small kind of, I think, symbols that convey something about the church that also are welcoming. And I also think the church needs to, in some way, grapple back from political parties her moral authority. Too often people are looking at political parties for guidance on what it means to be a good Catholic, rather than looking at the church for what does this mean to be a good Catholic. The church should not allow herself to be wed to either political party and be able to speak truth in justice and charity, no matter the situation, without, it really in some quarters seems like if you vote or aligned a particular way, then you're a better Catholic. And I think that's a big failure, and the church needs to get that back, that moral authority to be grounded in her and not political parties.
Amen. That was elucidated in the synthesis of the synod that the USCCB just released this past week, making that very point that fellow Catholics share that sentiment, that this polarization is and partisan party before being Catholic is backward. Jeff or Mary, other thoughts on this?
Well, one of the things I would like to see, and I think is necessary, is that the church has to learn humility. So often we speak as if we have all of the answers. And one of the things that what came out of the council was that the church doesn't have an answer to every single question, that the church can learn from the world. And Gaudium et Spes, it was rather controversial at the time, but that the church can learn from the world, and we aren't just dictating to the world, but we're also trying to understand and seeing where the Holy Spirit is at work. So that requires a humility that says we don't know everything, and we're going to listen to people. So I think it's part of the synodal process as well.
I agree with everything everyone said. I would just add, I think that in today's world, when I was growing up, the culture of the bigger world was in many ways very much in sync with the church. I mean, I didn't know a divorced person growing up, for example. I never met a divorced person. And so we didn't have abortion as an issue. It was illegal. No one even talked about it. So, gay marriage, the things that the church, taught were not in that contradictory to the rest of society. And I don't think we've made the adjustment of how do we be true to who we are and what we believe, but how do we, and I think Jeff was sort of suggesting in some way too, is how do we live in a bigger world and say, we don't have all the answers, and we have to at least grapple with some of these questions and try our best to say, how do we to deal with it? And I think people of my generation that aren't going to church any longer, they're just tired. They're just exhausted. It's just like, I can't do it anymore. And we said that earlier, but I think that theme is very true. It's exhausting to keep trying to fight for the issues. Even when the church stands for things that many of us want to see, they don't know how to speak for them sometimes. They don't know how to advocate even, and take immigration. We say all the right things but are we really? And then we back off. And it seems like that to me should be an issue that's not so controversial for us, but it is. And I think we're just suffering from exhaustion, and finding that energy is so important and so hard.
Yeah. When Leadership Roundtable was first created 20 years ago, it was in response, frankly, to the abuse crisis and the sudden consciousness across the country of how very serious that crisis was. And one of the first things we did was we surveyed through Zogby. We did a survey of what the most pressing concerns that bishops had in light of this crisis and everything else that was happening at the time, because our intervention was going to be in management of people, facilities, finances, sort of strengthening the temporal affairs of the church. And to our astonishment, the number one desire on the part of the bishops was they wanted tools and help to ensure that they were hospitable and welcoming, that our communities of faith, that our parishes, that our dioceses, our religious communities were welcoming and hospitable. What do you think the church could do to improve its inclusivity and hospitality so that all feel welcome? I loved your image, Gloria, to take a look at the images of holiness. Like, that's just a kind of a basic starting point. But what else could we do to improve inclusivity and hospitality?
So one of the things that I find that seems to puzzle people is they assume that welcoming and inclusivity necessarily means jettisoning our Catholic identity and our Catholic values. And I'm like, no, it's because of our Catholic identity and values that we're welcoming and inclusive. But what I'm finding is that people somehow want some kind of purity test about who they can welcome and who they can include. And I'm like, well, gee, none of us will qualify really if you make that the measure. But there's this, to me, just almost an irrational fear that if we're welcoming to these people, we'll get the cooties that they have. And it's just, I'm like, don't you know how to be family to people? Don't you know how to be curious, to get to know the people in your parish boundaries, the people that come to the Mass, that people are seeking and wanting to believe just as you believe? It seems like we don't have a kind of openness and curiosity about our neighbors, and our willingness to, be okay that people might believe differently on some things that us, we don't see eye to eye. And also that, that we all have a particular struggle in our path toward holiness. I have mine, some other people have theirs, but it doesn't mean because of these struggles, whatever they be, mine might be less public than other people's, whatever. But we need to learn how to jettison this sort of purity politic around who belongs in the church and who doesn't, and to be comfortable and loving of people because they are members of the human family, because they are made in the image and likeness of God, no matter what their struggle. That should be the basis for our welcoming, not if they, externally are living this pious and, devoted kind of way. So I think our own fear of who we associate with makes the church less welcoming, because we're focusing on somebody else's struggle rather than on the basic truth that they're a member of the human family. We share a common ancestor in God. And so we need to reorient how we even think about our neighbors and people coming to the parishes.
It's interesting. During COVID, one of my friends lives in Chicago, and when the churches were closed, she said, you should tune in to Old St. Pat's in Chicago. And so I did. And I can't tell you how fascinating it was that before the Mass would start, people would start chatting, and I knew there were so many people from all over the country, and I go, oh, I know that person, I know that person. And this is on, a Zoom mass. It was fascinating to me. But the point, and Gloria made me think of this, and something that people said earlier about humility. There was a march that the men's Black Baptist, the men of the Black Baptist Church invited the men of St. Pat's to join them in a march. And the people of Old St. Pat's got very angry afterwards because women weren't invited. And how come we participated in a march? Well, the pastor got up the next Sunday and apologized and explained why he did it, but said he was really sorry, but he felt that at this time he had to be respectful of the host who wanted this to be a men's march. And it was fascinating to see how many people then wrote in and started chatting what they thought. So that kind of, there were probably, I think there were like 4,000 people, honestly, at this particular liturgy, but how people were writing in and explaining how they were feeling. And I thought, this is a model of what we could be doing. And so there are models, I guess is my point. I think, Carrie, there are parishes out there that are doing these things. This particular parish has all kinds of ministries. They have ministry to gays. They have everything you could possibly want. And it's a very vibrant place. And I thought, if they can do it, it's doable, right? So I just wish we could take best practices and just let people and see how they could be expanded.
Yeah, I agree. I think the parish is really a critical institution, but this may seem odd, but one of the things I think we need is, playing off Gloria's purity, is we need a rediscovery or appreciation of sin, particularly sin in ourselves, so that when we look out, we don't say, oh, they're the sinners, but we start with again, going back to humility, we are sinners. And so we can relate to the other people because they're just like us. And so when you set yourself up as better, then that's where you have problems. But we want everybody to be pure. Anybody who sins, we immediately say, oh, we want them outside. But we're all sinners, so we all are part of that community.
If I could add just an example, Jeff, and something that Mary said made me think of it. My husband and I, a long time ago, helped grow the young adult ministry at the Mother Church of African American Catholics in Washington, D.C. That's what they call themselves, St. Augustine. We helped grow like the young adult ministry from like 5 people to over 150. And it was truly the face of the universal church. You had people of every race. You had people of different socioeconomic levels. You had people of varying sexual orientations. But what we had together was a deep, deep friendship. And, I kept thinking, why was that so successful? And you know why? Because we didn't shy away from the hard questions or the disagreements. Mary, I was thinking about how, as a group, a young adult group, we had gone out to dinner and we were having a shouting match over dinner about celibate priesthood and male only priesthood, that the whole restaurant and there was like hanging on every word that we're having. But what they saw, though, is people who loved each other and who were in friendship, really trying to work through what the church teaches and why, and what that means for our lives. And I don't think we do enough of that because we don't have those kinds of deep trust and friendship that allow people to really wrestle, but at the same time, not saying, you're a bad person and a terrible person because you don't agree per se. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. I think if we could just trust each other enough to know we all want a more vibrant church where all feel welcome. But in order to do that, then people have to be free to say and feel and express those feelings without any fear of recrimination or to be ostracized. Absolutely.
And no fear. Like the other thing is, I think we can't fear going and exploring it together. Well, what does the church say and why? And then sometimes among ourselves, we're like, we don't know. So we're like, who can we reach out to that can, come and talk to us about this? And so we reach out to the resources in the diocese or local Catholic universities to get someone who was, deeply versed on these matters and could come and talk with us and have that, back and forth, these deep, conversations.
Absolutely.
Gloria, you and I did not know this, but when I grew up in Washington, D.C., and St. Augustine's was my favorite parish, a favorite Catholic parish. My dad took my brother and me around lots of different ones, but I loved that particular parish community for exactly that sense of diversity, welcome, vibrancy. So thank you for being a leader and a model in that. I also, when you mentioned COVID, Mary, it struck me that there were some faith communities were really kind of paralyzed by it, by the lockdown, and others used that crisis to really live out of mission. And there were some pastoral teams that made the commitment to call down until they reached every single registered member of the faith community, just to touch base with them. How are you doing? Is there anything we can do? And then there was so much creativity too about, as you said, Gloria, availing yourself of a local professor or someone who has studied these various matters and might lead a Zoom discussion so that we could grow in our faith, even though we were all in lockdown and isolation. And it was really interesting to see those creative parishes that really just lived out of mission and didn't let the pandemic deter them, but it almost accelerated them in terms of being welcoming, inclusive, hospitable, and merciful. So my next question here, I get this a lot in my own life and dedication to the church. And I'm curious what you would say. So when people ask you specifically why you are Catholic or why you stay in the midst of all of these challenges, scandals, et cetera, what do you tell them?
I'll just start, and very simply, I just say, because imperfect as the church can be, I too am imperfect. And it goes back to what, Jeff was saying. I mean, I'm a sinner, I'm far from perfect. And, and for me, there is nothing better. I mean, some of my friends will say, we don't like the church teachings on this, this, and this. And I'll say, well, there's churches that believe what you believe and have what you want, where there are married clergy and gay marriage. And guess what? There's no one there either. Their churches aren't packed. So if the church changes all of the things that are bothersome, and some of those things bother me too, but if we change all those things, do you think it's really good? That's not the core of what's the problem. It goes back to some of the things Gloria and all of us were saying earlier. It's about, how do we have a church that's inclusive and welcomes everyone? Because we're all sinners. That's what Jesus did, welcomes everyone. So I'm there because I'm a sinner. And despite, I look back to the apostles, say they were no great shining stars, all of them either. And so the leaders of the church today, I always chuckle and say, why do you think they're going to be perfect today? They weren't perfect 2,000 years ago, because Christ wanted us to have an example of how in our brokenness we can still heal. And so to me, nothing else says that better than the church when it's at its best. And sadly, it's not always at its best, but if we don't stand there and try to push for it, it'll never happen. So that's why I stay.
Yeah, I always say that for me, it's the church is the best means for bringing me into contact with a God who is love, to a God who became a human being, who is pledged to be our companion always, and whatever we go through. And so that sort of personal encounter is important, but also the community of which I'm a part also feeds that connection with the church. And finally, the wisdom of the church, the 2,000 years of history and wisdom and things passed down that we've learned, all of that is things I would tell people about why I stay in the church.
Yeah, for me, when people ask me that, they usually have all these other adjectives that aren't so positive when they describe the church. But I tell them, I was a convert. I was a child convert. I converted at 12 and I went to church by myself. Nobody else in my family was Catholic. Why did I do that? Because I believe what the church teaches is true. And I cannot go without the sacraments. I could not imagine being cut off from the sacrament of reconciliation. I cannot imagine never being able to receive the Eucharist again. It just, I can't do that. And so I tell people I'm like a barnacle on the side of a ship. No storm is getting me off this church. Okay, none. And so I deeply believe in the truth of what your church teaches and the reality of the sacraments. So that's why I'm still Catholic.
Beautiful. It makes me almost yearn for the opportunity to hear from every Catholic. Why are you Catholic? I mean, the personal testimony is really beautiful and stunning. And I think we would be ennobled in and inspired in our own faith if we created space more for that particular question. So thank you all for answering
Isn't
that.
that a part of the synodal process though, too? Giving
It
people
is.
say that.
It is. Yeah. The question often is, what breaks your heart? What breaks your heart and what fills your heart about the church? And that's very revealing. And I like that the synod process is not just about having a synod. It's really the initiation of learning how to live synodally in relationship with one another as members of this global church, dreaming a new way forward. And I think there's a lot of wisdom in the attributes that went into a successful synodal experience, like deep listening and the invocation of the Holy Spirit. That bodes well for many of the themes that we're discussing tonight, as in fact. So I'm swinging now to the darker side, the kind of the shadow side of the experience of the church. And this question is, we've named some of these, but to what extent have you been affected by some of the sins in the church? For example, the abuse crisis, the church's own historical complicity in racial injustice, the attitude toward divorced and remarried Catholics, and the treatment of women, just to name a few.
You know, I had a personal experience of, it wasn't a sexual abuse, but it was an abuse in the sacrament of reconciliation when I was really like a new Catholic. I think it was about 13, and the priest wouldn't forgive something that I confessed. And so for a long time, I just was like, okay, this is my life now. I go to mass, but I'll never be able to receive the Eucharist. And the priest was wrong, actually. I basically said, hey, Father, I missed mass on Sunday. And he didn't inquire why. He didn't know, that I was a child that couldn't drive. I was the only Catholic in the family. And it was no church within walking distance. He didn't care he just like, that is unforgivable, that, I can't, forgive that. And I had no one to talk to because nobody else in my family was Catholic. So for a long time, I was like, just still going to mass, still praying, but just really having a lot of conversations internally and with God about his mercy and what will happen to me when I die. And it wasn't until I had the courage to much later in the sacrament of reconciliation, just mentioning that. And the priest like, wait, what? And he started asking me questions. He's like, that is not a sin. That was not a sin on your part. That was, and to have that forgiveness from this other priest just took this weight off of me. But to carry that around for such a long time, which was really an abuse of the sacrament, if you ask me, it was heavy. I mean, even so many years later, decades later, I still remember that sinking feeling sitting in the confessional and being told I could not be forgiven for this without the priest doing it, not caring at all, hearing the voice of a child and not caring at all to ask more questions. And it was a spiritual abuse, really. So yeah, that personally affected me, deeply. And but it didn't sour me on my trust of the presence of God in the sacrament for some reason. I think that was really just a grace. But yeah, no, that was a very deeply negative experience that affected me spiritually.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, there's just so many issues that you listed them there. I mean, a lot of them are just, remember when the Pennsylvania report came out, I'd known a lot about the different abuse, but it was just like a punch in the stomach at the time. And then the racial issues that Gloria has brought up, and the women, there's such an anger among so many educated women. So many women are right on the edge if they haven't already left. But there's this seething quality to it all. So how do I don't have a good answer to that question of how to deal with it, but other than to journey with people, to try to offer them as best you can a presence that acknowledges their pain and move on. Although I'm a historian too, so I remember the great opening speech that Pope John the 23rd gave at the council. In it, he said, you know, people were complaining about our era was the worst era of all time. And he said they acted as if they'd learned nothing from history, which is, after all, the teacher of life. So you learn that throughout the history of the church, you have all of these issues, all of these problems, but the grace persists that Jesus says, I will be with you till the end of the age. And so we have that faith that we can get through these different problems.
You know, I just want to zero in for a second on the sex abuse, because in my life, I've served on multiple review boards for dioceses and religious orders. And when I was at St. Vincent's, it's a psychiatric hospital, Cardinal O'Connor actually came to see me and asked me to start a program for priests. So I've been involved in it and I said I would only do it if I could really start with the victims. I'm happy to treat the priests, but we also treat the victims. But with that as backdrop, one of the things that always concerned and confused me about, you know, the sex abuse itself, as we all know, wasn't the issue so much as was the cover up of it. But and it always struck me as it's fascinating and scary and sad that the church never took the opportunity to say that most sex abuse happens in the home, and most people that are sexually abused are abused by a family member. That's incest, it's pedophilia. It's an issue that, yes, the church had its problems, but it's an enormous problem. You know, in any college campus today, we think that at least 20% of the students there have been victims of abuse, and I don't mean by the church, and yet we've never taken a stance on this. And those are the things that frustrate me sometimes, is that we're broken, we're sinners, bad things happen. Why don't we take an opportunity like that and say, let's educate the world and say, we messed up, but this is a bigger problem than the church's problem. It's an enormous problem, you know, from human trafficking, all these issues. Like, let's take our teachings on sexuality and put them into the context of the things we should be working on, you know, and that's, I guess I'm just voicing a little bit of my 40 years of frustration on this particular issue, which has become one that I've spent an enormous amount of my time on. So it frustrates me because we have so much opportunity to take our own sinfulness and turn it into a way that can be healing for a bigger world. And we don't do it often enough.
In all of what the three of you have named is the abuse of power, which is really striking to me, hearing it elucidated in this way and beginning with your story, Gloria, and then extrapolating to the abuse crisis, Mary, and the how women perceive their relationship to the church. It really is an abuse of power that has to be named and corrected. And with respect to the abuse, sexual abuse, I do think that there are those in the church now who say the spotlight is on the Catholic Church. We know it exists in every culture, and as you say, in families, etc. But because of this particular spotlight on the Catholic Church, as part of our recompense, we should go the extra mile and do everything we can to understand the causes, the contexts, the ways to identify the signs and sort of go the distance so that we might collectively, as part of our recompense, make a broader contribution to ridding the scourge of sexual abuse of children wherever it is. And I think that there are some leaders, I think Father Hans Zollner at the Gregorian in Rome is is commissioned by Pope Francis in essence to do just that. So we're not giving up. And as thankfully, what we have at our disposal whenever we are wrestling with such deeply injurious and sinful aspects of our experience of the church, we have the Eucharist. And that's where I want to turn our attention next. Pope Francis continues to emphasize the centrality of the Eucharist in the lives of Catholics as the glue that holds us together as a church. Are the three of you being nourished by good liturgy and preaching?
You know, where it's been lacking, I have to say, because, you know, I try to pray the Liturgy of the Hours, you know, morning and evening prayer, and meditate for half an hour at least a day. I find that the preaching doesn't always happen at Mass. You know what I mean? Sometimes it's in what I'm seeing, what I'm reading in the Liturgy of the Hours. Sometimes it's what I'm reading from saints like Saint Teresa of Avila, right? That really nourish me. So I guess I don't limit the where I get my nourishment to just happening at Mass daily or on Sunday. I'm trying to look at all the other riches and treasures of the church and avail myself of that. Obviously, you get scripture when you are doing the Liturgy of the Hours, but man, some of the saints and their writings are so profound, and just you can meditate on that and think about that. So I often turn to the saints to read what they have to say, particularly St. Catherine of Siena, St. Teresa of Avila, St. Francis de Sales, and Venerable Granada, who was a Dominican, wrote some amazing things as well. So yeah, that's where I also try to get my good preaching when it's not necessarily so great at Mass per se.
I would say there's some great preaching on this panel too.
I feel I'm pretty blessed because I'm at university communities. I'm at UC San Diego, University of San Diego, and you have a lot of attention paid to the liturgy and to the preaching. So it's one of the problems is then when you go back into ordinary parishes, you might not find that same level of preparation and of preaching. Although in the parish I'm involved with in Berkeley, it's in the Graduate Theological Union parish. So again, it's another parish that has a great deal of good liturgy and preaching.
I would say, you know, I actually have gotten to the point where I shop around and I go to the churches that feed me, and I actually now go to several different churches in my community for different reasons, and so I've been fairly blessed in that regard, you know, to be able to find places that really do feed me. And like you too, Gloria, I mean, a lot of what I do on my own, but the liturgy is important to me in the Eucharist. And I worry with COVID, even a number of people that were practicing Catholics I know, they're still doing Zoom masses because they like the preaching and they like the music, and they're not going back, you know, and I preach a lot, small p, preach. I preach a lot to people about don't you miss being in community and going to communion, because I mean I couldn't wait to get back into church for that reason. But I think we're lucky growing up as a baby boomer. The church where you lived geographically, you really had to go there. I mean, you know, in elementary school, they used to take attendance on Sunday in my Catholic school, so they knew whether you were there. So that's what I was used to. So I love the fact that we have flexibility. If you don't like one parish, we all have, you know, we live in a world today where it's not inaccessible, you know, to find another one.
But didn't we lose something with that too? Because if you were in a parish that you didn't like, you had to kind of find a way to exist in it or to change it. And now you don't, you just go to the next parish.
Yeah. Well, it's sort of like the market. You'd hope that people would get the parishes that aren't faring so well, you know, would sort of get the message that, you know, maybe there's, you know, it all comes down to, one of my priest friends always says, look, if you've got a great homily, good music, and you're joyful, that's it. You don't really need to do much else. Be joyful, make people happy they're there, have a decent homily, have good music, and you're done. And that's simplistic, but to some degree that's true. That's what we want. at least at Mass. We need more than that, but that's really what draws us, I think, in and makes us feel good about the experience.
That Sister Maria, do you remember Mother Rosalie Hill's famous that beauty will attract them, but the truth will keep them? So I think that's a good motto for parishes as well.
Beautiful. Okay, so next up, I'm going to turn our attention to Pope Francis. Christopher Bourne is an assistant professor of religion and culture at the Catholic University of America. And he has tracked the journey of Catholic boomers from the tumultuous 60s to a time of growing mistrust of institutions writ large. He says boomers consider Pope Francis the real thing. Interestingly, we also see this among youth. Gloria and I were just at a conference at Georgetown University when one of the hosts spoke about asking her students at the beginning of the semester to list a global challenge and then one word to describe the church and one word to describe Pope Francis. And the results of this were really fascinating. The challenges were serious and varied. The words describing the church were mixed, but generally negative. And Pope Francis came across overwhelmingly positive. So what do you make of this phenomenon about Pope Francis, particularly juxtaposed to not as many positive things to say about the church?
Well, I think Pope Francis is speaking to things that young people care about. They consider him the Green Pope. He just explaining or articulating things that I think people generally don't associate with the church, like care of creation. Our Catholic social teaching, I think, is like our best kept secret, but what hearing Holy Father talk about care of creation, our responsibility for that, I think is refreshing to young people. Of course, they know all the other kind of things that the Holy Father spoken about, but to hear that seemed to just, at least in the United States, be so current and a concern that young people have, that I think that makes them believe, which I believe is true, that he is aware of what's concerning to them, and he helps them to see how the faith has something to say in this area as well. So I mean, it's just one reason I think that he's received so warmly by the youth, as he's speaking to things that they care about.
I also think he appeals both to the boomers and the young, just with the word authenticity. He's authentic. I remember the Port Huron statement. Remember that back in 1962, Tom Hayden, and in it says, "We want to live lives of personal authenticity." And that became something of a buzzword during the love generation and the culture. And I think it's something that still resonates with me, and I think it resonates with the youth as well.
I think I still remember the day, I was at the college the day that he was the announcement came out, and when he chose the name Francis, I will never forget. I mean, I was at a Franciscan school, so of course that particularly touched their hearts, but I remember they were saying, this is going to be a pope who really cares about the people, and he's going to be down to earth, and it's not going to be about, his red shoes. It's going to be about being a real human being. And I think young people see that, and then just saying really what was already said. But I believe that a personal attraction is what has always was the way people had their vocations. They loved Sister Madeline, so they wanted to be like her, or Father Smith. And I believe that's still the case. I mean, he represents, that's one of the beauties of our faith. I was listening to Muslims recently saying they wish they had a spokesperson as we do. As Catholics, we're fortunate to have that face of it, because there's really no discussion, over what, in a good way. When I say no discussion, we it's clear he is the face of our religion, and I think that's one of our blessings. And I think young people recognize that he's the face of Catholicism.
Well, I know that we're coming to a point where we're going to soon entertain questions from the audience. So I would like to just conclude this section with a final question, which is very simple, and that is, what gives you hope?
I'll start very quickly and just say what has always given me hope is reading and listening to the prayers of the youth. I used to go in the chapel every morning and see what students wrote. And at Alverno, they had a book in the back where you could write in your prayer requests. And I used to laugh to myself saying, when I was their age, I was praying for A's and that my boyfriend would be nice to me. They're praying for, the environment and justice and racial equity, justice for all and all these things. And I thought, God bless them. That's not where I was at their age. And that gives me some hope if we can figure out a way to keep them and grow those numbers and keep them engaged.
Yeah, I agree. The youth give me a lot of hope, but also what sustains me, I mentioned it earlier, is just the end of the Gospel of Matthew. Behold, I am with you always, even till the ends of the age, that Jesus has promised to be with us. And I reflect on that a lot, and it sustains me in times of great doubt and trauma.
I would say, what gives me hope is, the belief that the victory's already been won, and that right now I just need to try to grow in holiness and sow the seeds of the gospel, come what may. And so it's not on me. It's not on me. The Lord's already won. The victory's been won, and that heaven is real. And that gives me a lot of hope, and that the Lord wants all of us to be there with him. There's just something about that this invitation to heaven made possible by Christ's passion and resurrection is just, it gives me a lot of hope. God does love us and want us to be with him. So that gives me hope.
Well, and what gives me hope is that there are men and women like the three of you who have seen so much and been so involved in the life of the church at the local and diocesan and national level and international level. And in spite of how much you have seen, you are so articulate and so compelling. You ennoble my spirit, and I'm sure those of our participants too. So thank you for your eloquence. Thank you for your faith. Thank you for your generosity of time in this conversation. So we do have some questions now that I will pose to you. The first has to do with young people in particular. When you see the number of young people who feel alienated from the church over some of its views, do you feel any obligation to nourish their faith and keep them in this faith community?
Yeah, I'd say yes. I mean, I do get the opportunity to go around to universities, and a lot of times when I go, I do get a lot of questions about that. And a lot of times what I find is, even among young people, they're getting catechized by the TV, not by engaging with the church actually has to say on these things. And so to have an invitation, like I will say to them, come on, let's examine the truth together. What does the church actually say? Does she really say what you think she's saying? And I at least find that some young people that are interested in trying to understand what it is that the church is saying, when they go and look, they're a little bit surprised that she does have rational, positions on why she believes what she believes, and that they haven't really had the opportunity yet to engage with what the church says, but rather however it's displayed in secular media. So yes, absolutely. I reach out an invitation and say, well, let's go look. What does she actually say? Does it make any sense? What are your sources that you're examining? Why don't you look at what the church herself says rather than trying to get it through Tucker Carlson or MSNBC or CNN? You know what I mean? So go see what she says for herself. So yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I think of my nieces. I have three nieces, young women, all have just graduated from college, all very bright young women. And how do they find a place within the church? Because they are so dissatisfied with so many of the issues, particularly LGBTQ and issues of that sort. But it also, when I'm trying to, you come to see that there's an explosiveness in the church's teaching. University of San Diego, a few years ago, we had our valedictorian was the head of the Pride community. And in his speech, he said it was Catholic social teaching that made him a fully human, that he became aware of his dignity, and that it led in a direction that most people wouldn't think Catholic social teaching would lead. So I think when we actually look at Catholic social teaching and what it teaches, it's explosive, and we really don't know where it's going to go. And so if we just open them to that, it'll give them avenues that they can perhaps find something worth doing.
I agree with everything that's been said. I think we all know one of the challenges is that our youth, I used to chuckle, and Sister Maria probably saw this much more than I did at the seminary, but often even young men who wanted to be priests and how little they really truly knew of their faith. And I used to marvel they're willing to make this kind of a commitment, and they haven't really had the formation either than, say, people of baby boomers. And so it's challenging to be able to present to them what the church really teaches in a way when they haven't really had it. You know, they come to a college, for example, at 18, and many of them, not all, but many of them really don't understand their faith and don't know even very real basics. So it's a challenge, but, you know, it's one we have to meet. And it's one, if we don't meet it, who will? We have to stand up and do it.
Great responses. So here is another question. I'm really intrigued by this question. Do you think we will see another post-Vatican II energy that was unleashed in the late 60s and throughout the 70s, a time of hope, creativity, and inclusivity?
I pray we do.
I hope we do too, and I think you said this before, Jeff. It's about believing. So did you too, Gloria. You know, it's Christ's church, and you know, the Holy Spirit has to come in too. We can cooperate with grace, but it's going to take. Sometimes I think I wish, you know, we could have some apparition from on high that wasn't just to a couple of people, but the whole world could see it instantaneously, and our work would be done for us. But I think, you know, it was given to us to make that happen, and it's a lot. It's not going to be easy, but I have hope. I believe that we can do better, and I pray every day that we do.
Well, I was going to say, I think we have to remember it's a global church, and there is that energy and creativity, maybe not to the degree we want to see here in the United States, but believe me, it's there in other countries. I mean, look at the explosive growth of the church in Asia and Africa. So much so that they think that the priests from those continents will come to our country and be the ones evangelizing us. So it's not that it isn't somewhere in the church, because I think it is, but maybe not so much the degree that we want right now in the United States, what we want to see here, but have hope that it is elsewhere.
Yeah, and I would have to agree too. I spend a lot of my focus thinking of the global universal church and seeing the incredible diversity, and it's tempting to just be parochial in our viewpoint, and there's just so much happening. But I also take great encouragement about and a hopefulness around my own answer to this question from Cardinal Grech, who is leading with Sister Natalie this global synodal process. And he and 35 women and men from every continent are gathered in Frascati right now as we are speaking to synthesize 115 syntheses from across the globe. And he lifted out themes just a few days ago when he was sort of beamed in through Zoom to our Leadership Roundtable conference. And it was striking how many of the themes all across the globe are consonant. And it just feels like the Holy Spirit's presence is so evident in this. So lots to come and a lot of prayers needed for this ongoing process. But it seemed particularly reminiscent of Vatican II, and the themes that are being elucidated seem like the next wave of Vatican II. So kudos to whoever submitted that question. I think we probably have time for one more. And this is a question, I'll read it as it is written, very interesting. Many of our parenting generation are requesting to have their children received first Eucharist, but go to evangelical churches for their weekly worship. Why do you think this is a reality in the church today?
You know, if I could venture to answer that, we were seeing the same thing in certain communities with regard to confirmation. The families would have this big confirmation celebration for their children and whoop, never see them again. It became more of a cultural marker that this is something that needs to happen, it's something that's celebrated. But the rest of it, the follow through with everything else that you need to do after receiving the sacrament seemed to not factor. So I'm wondering how much of it is, you know, this is what we do. We have a first communion celebration, but after that we could go wherever we want and do whatever we want. Seems to be more that it's some kind of ceremonial marker than it is a real engaging with the faith. And so they're happy to have the first communion, but just go worship somewhere else, not even realizing that, you know, they're not even receiving the Eucharist when they're going someplace else without going to Mass on Sunday. So sometimes I wonder if it's just a ceremonial marker for some people.
Can I sneak one final one in? I think, yes, we still have some time, and this just arrived. Can the three of you imagine what could happen in the church to bring so many women back, women who love the church, but have been fed up with being considered second-class citizens and without a seat at the table? So can you imagine something we could do in the church to bring back women who have left frustrated, as Jeff had alluded to earlier?
I mean, where would we be without women in the church? You know, I was just actually with the Felician sisters at their conference, and I was so thankful for these women who recognize they aren't second-class citizens in the church. I mean, where would the university system be without women? Where would the medical system in this country be without women, considering the strong and education? So I want to challenge the idea that we're second-class citizens, because look at all the things that we were able to establish in the church in the United States as women. So I kind of want to push back on that. And I think if we could get these women back in the church and seeing how much women do contribute to the church, I think the church would be, 10 times flourishing, you know, than it is right now. Just imagine all the creativity and the gifts that all these women would bring with them when they come back to the church.
I don't think it's enough just to say that they aren't second-class citizens. The reality is they feel that. Mm-hmm. And so the question is, how do you deal with their feelings, and how do you give them an experience so that they can come back in? That's the question, I think. It's not that, oh, you're not second-class citizens, because that's the reality that they experience is that they are. Whether it's right or not isn't as important as the fact that that is how they feel.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a really important question. I struggled with this, as I said, especially being a leader at a women's college. It's such a painful issue, and I don't know the answer. It was interesting because I remember one of the more powerful conversations was a group of students saying, we hope the priests never are allowed to get married, because then women will never get a leg up. You know, because they'll have more priests and women will never be able to get their voice if that happens. So I think so many women, I wish I had the answer to that, and I try to be hopeful as to what message to give them, but I personally I haven't seen anything changing that's going to do that. And I like Gloria's point of reminding the women of what a role they have had and how they've played that role, and that's true, but I think they still feel that's because they're out there doing all the hard work, but they don't really have a say. I don't know. It's probably just on a personal level, it's the most painful issue I deal with within the church, and as a woman, and I'm not sure, I'm not sure what else we can do other than pray and hope that the Holy Spirit can somehow enliven our discussions and find a way to have women have their rightful role.
So I guess, because I've talked about this kind of thing, I think sometimes we associate, being a priest with having real power in the church. And I don't associate that with having real power in the church. I just think about the parishes where I've been, that women, all the things that they've run. The pastor could not survive without these women in the church, on the parish council, and all the things they did to keep the church operating, as well as all the ministry outreach. And so maybe I have a different conception of power in the church. And I think that might be why I'm like, well, we're not second-class citizens. In fact, you are more free because you have not taken some vow of obedience to the bishop. Run with that freedom, girl. Run with it. What do you just saying, so maybe
On that note,
different conception of power, I suppose.
That's a wonderful way to conclude this really vibrant conversation tonight. Run with that girl, run. So, Carrie, that's what we're trying to do. And hopefully Spirit Alive is bringing life into a lot of people so that they can run with the Spirit for the upbuilding of the church. So, Carrie, Jeff, Gloria, Mary, I think we've become a nice community of friends, and I hope we can be back again together sometime soon. So thanks so much for taking the time out of your very, very busy schedules to be with us. God bless, and good night from Spirit Alive. Thank you.